All right, welcome to our first lesson on our series on idolatry. This is a study that I began because it really intrigued me with some questions about idolatry. A lot of times when we study the Bible, especially starting out, we will look at things from the standpoint of they do exist. We read about them in the Bible, and we read about what they're all about, how they function. But eventually we get to that point and we ask some deeper questions. We ask questions like, when? When did this start? How and why? And so that's where I got to with the subject of idolatry. I wanted to know more about when all this began and why, for some reason, men who had Yahweh the Creator as their God rejected him, and how they went about to create their own gods. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever thought about, does idolatry exist today? And I would say that most of us would say, because we're God-fearing, believing in Jesus Christ people, yes, we believe idolatry exists today. But am I an idolater? How do I know what idolatry looks like today? And how do I know when I've crossed that line that I can actually become idolatrous today? And if you've ever been interested in any of these questions, this series will really help you. I started out the study of this subject and with these questions in mind, and what I discovered went beyond what I ever expected, beyond my imagination. And so I hope that you'll stick with this, because you're going to learn some things you never, ever dreamt you could learn about God and about the Bible and about the evidence of God from paganism, from idolatry. And so what we're going to do in this series is we're going to look at the history of idolatry. We're going to see what we can learn from it in regards to the Bible. We're going to look at the evidence of idolatry in the Bible. And so let's start off with our questions. In this series, we're going to deal with, especially in this lesson, when did men begin to turn to their own gods? Does the Bible tell us that? Does it give us any information about that? And I believe it does. And so we're going to deal with that in this particular lesson. We're also going to ask the question, why? And that will be lesson number 2. Why did men turn away from Yahweh and start creating their own gods? And then thirdly, we're going to talk about how. How did they come up with these gods? How did all this happen? And we're going to open up to some historical information, and we're just going to learn a whole lot. Not only about idolatry, about God and his existence. So, let's talk about, first and foremost, what is an idol? That this is probably going to be a very debatable subject. But basically, when you think about an idol, what makes a god? What makes something a deity to someone? Well, the first thing that we learn is that an idol really can be just about anything. Now, when we think about idolatry, we almost always think about what we would call ancient idolatry or biblical idolatry, where we see these stories about people in the Bible creating with their hands some statue of a god. And sometimes it's in the form of an animal, a creature. Sometimes it's in the form of a human being. Sometimes it has both forms. We think about temples and sacrificing to these gods. And even beyond our imagination, sacrificing their own children to an idol. But here's the question. Can idolatry and does idolatry exist today? And the answer to that is yes. And so what is an idol? Well, what I would say an idol is, it's anything or anyone that you devote time, energy, and trust in. And so an idol can be, it can be a person. It can be an inanimate object like a car, money. It can be an activity. It can be even a pursuit, something that you pursue. And so it's something that is very important to us. We spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of energy, we put a lot of trust into whatever be this deity. And not only this, but I think some of the telltale signs of idolatry is that it's something that makes you change your thoughts or affects your thoughts. It affects the way you behave. It affects your priorities in life. In fact, it becomes a priority in your life, probably your utmost priority. And it affects your life in the sense it can even affect your mood. For example, gambling. I believe gambling can be an idol, a deity for someone. And what have you noticed about gamblers in that mode? Well, it affects their whole attitude. When things are going well with their God and they're winning and their God, as they see it, is providing these victories, they're as happy as a lark. They're excited, they're smiling, they're laughing, but it can happen in a split second to where they start losing. And their God, what? Brings about a losing streak. And their whole mood is affected. They are upset. They are depressed. Life is just miserable because gambling is everything to them. And winning is everything to them. So that's one example. And so when we look at that, idols can be things. They can be statues. They can be items. They can be things like money, hobbies, the pursuit of fame, popularity, etc., etc. And so that is what modern idolatry looks like. And what makes modern idolatry kind of challenging, again, when we think about idolatry, we almost always go to that biblical, ancient form of idolatry. It's so visible. It's a statue. It's temples. It's people bowing down to these gods and putting all their faith and trust and petitioning these fake gods. But in modern idolatry, it's a little bit harder because today's idols are what I would say are mutually neutral. They are mutually neutral. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take money. I think most people could see that how money could become an idol, could become a god for somebody, with all the characteristics of what we just talked about life and so forth. And so when you talk about that, money is what? Money is not bad in itself. It's neither good or bad. It's what money means to you. It's how you use money, right? And so money's morally neutral. So if you have money, if you use money, does that make you an idolater? No, not necessarily. Jesus used money. So it's a little more difficult. It's hard for preachers to preach about idolatry because of this very thing. A lot of people think, well, since it's morally neutral, I don't have a problem with it. It's the other guy that has the problem, not me. And so it's very hard to get people today to think and even admit that something's become an idol to them. Sports, money, some type of pursuit, some type of addiction. Because they're morally neutral. So how do I know when I cross that line? Well, again, I don't know if I can pinpoint it, be dogmatic, but again, I would look for those tall tell signs. Is it something that governs your life, your priorities, even affects your mood? Those are some signs to really look for as we talk about modern day idolatry. So with that in mind, as we go to the Bible now, what kind of idolatry do we see? Well, I believe we see two types of idolatry. Number one is what I call selfishness, living for self. And so this is characterized by someone that obviously denies God, denies Yahweh, the Creator. And we're, of course, approaching this as God-believing people, using the Bible as our standard. And so this is a person that rejects God and says, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to serve my own purposes. What I believe is right is all that matters. And when you think about it, that's a big type of idolatry in the world today. I've heard a lot of people where you bring up something that God says in the Bible, usually it's a moral issue, and they'll say, well, I don't believe that. I don't think that's accurate. And so what they do is they're saying, well, what I believe is more important than what God says. And so in essence, they become God. And they bend to, and they devote themselves to whatever they feel is right. And there might be a number of reasons why they feel that way. But it's a rejection of God and what He says, and acceptance of, and a heightening of what I want, what I believe, what I desire. And what is interesting, we're going to talk about this in just a second more in depth. What is interesting is that this type of idolatry is kind of the type that we see at the very beginning of the book of Genesis. But let's talk about that more in just a second. The second type of idolatry is probably the one that we think of more often, and that is the more visible form where it's an actual worship of other things and or gods. And this is what we start to see after the flood. And so we're going to break up our study into two periods of time. We're going to first look at from creation to the flood, and there's a reason for that. And what can we learn from the Bible about idolatry in that period? And then we're going to look from the flood to modern day. And I realize those are uneven chunks of time, but there's a reason that we're looking at it from that standpoint. So, as we move on, let's talk a little bit about our timeline. Okay? So we've got our timeline here. We're going to start again. As Bible believers, we're going to start with creation, right? Now, what do we know about creation? Well, there was no idolatry. Adam and Eve were created by God, and they had a relationship with God. They had fellowship with God. They worshiped God. So when did all that begin? When did idolatry begin? Well, again, from the period of creation all the way to the flood, that's going to be our first period of time. We don't read about idols in temples and sacrificing to other gods. Now that doesn't mean people didn't do it. It just means the Bible doesn't give us any record of it, any evidence of it. Instead, it appears that this period of time you have more of what we call type 1, the worship of self. And perhaps that's why Moses is telling us about the story of Cain. killing Abel, and what happens to his descendants in Genesis chapter 4, how they just kind of increase in their selfishness. Maybe that's a hint as to when this idolatry and how it begins. Men saying, no, I want to do it my way. Well, what happens? Well, we know that God looks down upon the earth. How many times does that happen in the first 6 chapters of Genesis? Quite a bit. And what he sees is he doesn't like it. He doesn't like the idolatry that he sees. And what is it? That every man is just doing what he wants to do. And what man wants to do is what God calls evil. And so the flood actually comes because of this selfish type of idolatry. And God's going to start all over. And so you have Noah, and you have Noah's wife, and of course his 3 sons and daughters-in-law. And so God starts all over with the flood. And so in a way, Noah and his wife become the new Adam and the new Eve, the second Adam and the second Eve. And when the flood's all over, what happens? Well, Noah comes out of the ark, and the first thing he does, what's he do? He worships God. He builds an altar, Genesis 9, and he sacrifices one of every clean animal. So what would Noah want after the flood? Well, Noah's fully aware why the flood came, because of this type of idolatry. And so he's going to want not only his sons, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons, and his great-great-grandsons to be believers and worshipers of Yahweh. And so he's going to teach them the stories of creation and Adam and Eve, and about how God dealt with all of them. He's going to tell them these stories. And he's going to tell them of the story of the flood, all in hopes that we cannot repeat what happened with the flood. That we would stay away from this type of idolatry. So as we move on now in our timeline, the very next story that Moses in the book of Genesis tells us is the story of the Tower of Babel. And so what is this story of the Tower of Babel? Is this just a story where now we learn where all these languages came from? Is this just a story where we know where all these different people came from? Well, it does tell us that, but I think Moses has more in mind. In fact, as you read Genesis 11, where this story is found, and you combine it with Genesis 10, I believe Moses, you put those together, Moses is trying to tell us a story of when idolatry started. Now, obviously, after the time of the flood, we still have type number 1. In fact, because of type number 1, oftentimes you get led into type number 2. Men wanting to create what? Their own gods. To have their own attributes and their own traditions and their own way of worshiping them. But as we go on after the time of the flood, we start to see hints and evidence of type number 2. The actual worship of idols. And that's highlighted as you continue to go through the Old Testament and even into the New Testament and even into present time. As we said, idols are still around. They kind of look different. They're morally neutral, but idolatry is still alive and well today. So we have this second type of idolatry going on, right? So let's talk about in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. Are there signs of idolatry? This is the second type of idolatry. And the answer is yes. The first one is found in Genesis chapter 31. Now, let me tell you, with Genesis 31, in fact, all of Genesis, Moses is not writing the book of Genesis with the idea, I'm going to write about the history of worship. Okay, I understand that. But what we're doing is we're taking that subject and we're now opening up the book of Genesis and saying, what does he tell us about worship and what can we learn from it? And so in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel seems to be the start of it, but it's not until Genesis 31 verse 30 do we actually get the first reference to it. Now, if there's a reference that I'm missing, let me know. I know God tells Abraham that he's going to occupy the land of the Canaanites, but there's nothing in there specific because of their idolatry, because they worship these gods or have these temples. So the first one I find is in Genesis 31 verse 30, and it's a story where Jacob runs away from Laban. Because Laban's a terrible person. Laban's this control freak. And sure enough, even though he goes secretly, when Laban finds out, he comes after them. And he catches up to them. But Laban doesn't want them to know that he's a control freak. And so when he gets to them, he doesn't say, hey, this is why I caught up to you. Here's the answer he gives. This is why I pursued you. He says, and now you have indeed gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? And so I want you to notice the plurality there. Now Laban is supposed to be a worshiper of Yahweh. That's the whole premise of this family, Abraham's family, in the book of Genesis. They are God's people. But notice, Laban has these gods. And unbeknownst to Jacob, Rachel has stolen them. Look at verse 34. Now Rachel had taken, and look at how they're referred to now, the household idols, and put them in the camel's saddle. And she sat on them. And so apparently what these are these smaller versions, not the lifelike statues, but these smaller versions of these gods that you bring into your house and you worship these gods at the house. In fact, some houses actually created a little shrine for their god or gods. And perhaps that's what Laban had done. Now, why Rachel had stolen these, there's a lot of different views. I don't know. But here you have your first reference to idolatry in the book of Genesis. The next one that I could find, and again, if I miss something, let me know. Genesis 35, verse 2. And Jacob's family is now back down in Canaan. They've been there several years, living in Shechem. But Jacob looks at his family, and they're not godly like they should be. They're not wholeheartedly given to God. And why? Because of idols. Because of the influence of these pagan nations. And so in Genesis 35, verse 2, he has a family meeting, and he says to his household, to all who are with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Again, I want you to notice the reference to gods, plural. And notice he talks about them being foreign. They're not our gods. They're the gods of the Canaanites. And so you need to what? Put these away. We're having a reformation, if you will. Look, if you would, at verse 4. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had. And look at this. And the rings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem, So not only do they give up their foreign gods, but they realize they have these earrings. And apparently in idolatry, there wasn't just the worship of idols, there was a certain way to look, a certain way to adorn yourself. And these earrings was part of that. And so they understood that was part of the influence, that was part of the idolatry. And so they give up the earrings as well. And interestingly, just a little addition here, Jacob moves his family away from that influence of Shechem, and he takes them back to Bethel, back to where his relationship with God really started. Bethel, which translated means house of God. It's a fascinating story. And so again, we have idolatry. And then the last one that we have is in Genesis 38, verse 21. And this is the story of Judah. We'll tell this very quickly. Judah having relations with his daughter-in-law, who has disguised herself as a prostitute. And you can read that story, Genesis 38, more in depth if you want. It's kind of a disturbing story. But let's take a look at this passage in verse 21, where basically Jacob, or excuse me, if I said Jacob, I meant Judah. Judah has to now go back and pay the prostitute. He gave her some collateral. He didn't have any money. So now he's going back, but he doesn't find her. And look at what chapter 38, verse 21 says. And he asked the men of her place, saying, where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? And but they said, there's been no temple prostitute here. And so what I want you to notice, a couple things here. First thing, I want you to know, in a lot of translations, the word temple does not appear in the passage. I'm reading from the New American Standard. I want you to know that. And it, along with some other modern translations, do put the word temple prostitute here. But it is not in the original Hebrew, apparently. But it's an insertion by the translators. So the question comes about, why would they insert temple and make her a temple prostitute and not just a temple prostitute? Well, the answer seems to be obvious. They believe that's exactly what was going on here. Because that's the type of prostitution they had in those days. It was an idolatrous temple prostitution. And this just goes to show you that the second type of idolatry has definitely involved in it the first type of idolatry, the selfishness. How perverted does idolatry get? Well, we already mentioned the sacrificing of children to fake gods, to stone, rock statues. But here's another perversion that just floors us. That they actually put the act of prostitution, harlotry, that is condemned throughout the Bible as an act of religious service to these pagan gods. That's incredible. And so I want you to know that the word temple isn't here, but it's inserted by the translators probably for a very good reason. And that being true, this is our first reference to a temple in the Bible. The first reference to a type. So, as we look at these references, we've got three references to idolatry. And what these show us is not only that idolatry was alive and well at that time, but that God's own people struggled to stay away from it. God's people struggled to keep away from that influence and the popularity of it. And so what often happened with Laban, Jacob's family, that they kind of try to live in both worlds. And so they wanted to be dedicated to Yahweh, but they also wanted to have all the glamour of idolatry as well. It kind of reminds you of Joshua 24, where Joshua says to the people of Israel, you've got to make up your mind. You can't do this. You can't worship both Yahweh and the idols. You've got to make up your mind. And then those famous words, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. We'll serve Yahweh. And so what we need to understand as we look at this is that these are a few references to idolatry, but idolatry started much earlier. By the time we get to Jacob's time, we can see it is in full swing. But how does it get that way? Well, let's finish off lesson number 1 by talking about when did all this start. I already talked a little bit about it, but I believe that Moses is showing us that the Tower of Babel is that story that brings the world into full idolatry. There's an explosion of idolatry with the Tower of Babel. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read that whole story for you. You can pause the video right here and you can read the story. But I'm going to make a few points about that story of the Tower of Babel. And I'm going to compare it to the story of Noah. So, I make this point that Noah was commanded to build the ark, and he built the altar to honor God. But you have another building project here, and that is the building of the city of Babel. And in the center of that city was this great tower, this great ziggurat, as they call it, that was supposed to reach up into heaven. So you have Noah, right, that new Adam, that second Adam, and he's a builder. He was commanded to build the ark. He built the altar to God, but both of those was what? Both in obedience and honor of God. But what do you have in the story of the Tower of Babel? You've got a pursuit to build something for not God, but for themselves. Go back even further to the end of Genesis chapter 4, the beginning of Genesis chapter 5. You have a reference there that after Cain killed Abel, Eve gave birth to another son. She named him Seth. He was the replacement of Abel. And what it says there is that with the birth of Seth, men began to call on the name of the Lord. It might actually be Seth's son that's born, but around that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. And you see that reference in the book of Genesis quite often. In fact, throughout the Bible. Calling on the name of the Lord. But in this project, they're not trying to honor God. They're not trying to call on the name of God. But what? They're building this tower in the city to make a name for themselves. And it says that in that story, to make a name for themselves. And these are all details Moses is giving us because he's painting a picture here. And so, as God comes and he looks down, he is not pleased. He sees that the people are united, but it is not a godly unity. It's a worldly, sinful type of unity. And so God says it's not good. This is not the unity I want. And so what does God do? God confuses their languages. And so as you read the story, you can clearly see Moses is telling us, number one, God is not involved with their plans. They're doing this for themselves, to make a name for themselves, to make themselves big and strong in reputation. But he's also telling us something else about this. And I believe this is really the start of idolatry. I want you to think about this. Put yourself back in the Tower of Babel. You're sitting there and you're working on this tower, right? And you're talking to your partner over here. He's working over here. You got another partner over here. He's working. And you guys are kind of talking as you work. It makes it a little more pleasurable. And all of a sudden, God confuses the languages. Now you can't understand this guy. And you can't understand this guy. And you're confused. And what are they saying? I don't know what they're saying. All of a sudden, something's happened. Everybody's had a stroke. You can't understand what they're saying. And then off in the distance, you hear your own language. Have you ever been in a foreign crowd where it's speaking a different language than yours? And then you hear an English speaker. Even if it's a little distance between you and them, you can make that out so crystal clear. Because it's the thing you understand. It's the thing you recognize. So I can imagine what they do is they go and they find these people. And I would imagine that God kept families together, same language. And so now you find the people that speak your language. And what happens? Well, you start to dwell with these people. These are now your people. They're like you. You can understand. You can communicate with them. And so eventually, these groups, what? These groups start their own towns, and then they grow, and they start their own cities. In fact, in Genesis, we start to see kings over cities. City kings. And eventually they get so big that they become nations. And that's exactly what we read in Genesis chapter 10, the chapter before this. And so stick with me on this. As you're reading Genesis chapter 10 about all these nations, the Tower of Babel happens. The Tower of Babel happens inside chapter 10. Especially there's a reference there to the dividing of the earth, the dividing up of the earth. I believe that's a statement that's talking directly about this story, the Tower of Babel. And so as you look at chapter 10, what you have these genealogies telling you where all these nations come from, right? And if you calculate all that out, you get a certain period of time. We'll talk about that in a second. But what happens? These nations start forming their own culture. They used to be all one, but now they're all different. And so they start forming their own culture. And so what? They start forming their own types of food, their own cultural dishes. Their own dances and celebrations. Just last February, I got to go out to Epcot down in Orlando, Florida. And what is Epcot? Well, if you've ever been there, you know it's the land of nations. And you go from one nation to another nation to another nation. And there's different restaurants that serve different food of that nationality and different types of dress and song and music and dance and all that. And that goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel. But here's the thing. They also create their own religion. The religion of culture. And isn't it interesting that in Christianity today, we have many people creating the cultural church. That's right. When we don't learn from the lessons of the past, we are condemned to repeat them. And so all of these nations start forming their own religion. They're all different. But actually, they're all the same. They're all different in that their gods are all called different things, but they're all the same in that they have multiple gods, and they all have the God of the sun, and the God of the earth, and the God of the wind, and the God of war, and the God of love. They just have different names. They're all different, but they're all the same in that they all, for the most part, reject Yahweh and create their own gods and their own worship and their own traditions. And so as you look at that, this is all mapped out in Genesis chapter 10. That's where all these nations come from. They're all different, but they're all the same. And in the book of Genesis, the Bible then centers in on a son of Ham, and his name is Canaan. And we learn a lot about idolatry from the people of Canaan. And we know exactly where they live. And so as we end, let me give you the premise of this whole series. This is going to launch in the whole series. So, when does idolatry start? Well, especially the second type of idolatry starts after the flood. But when does it start? Well, I believe Moses is telling us that it starts with the Tower of Babel. Prior to that, what? Noah worships and teaches about God. He teaches the story about creation. He teaches the story about Adam and Eve and the story of Cain and Abel. He tells the story of the flood from generation to generation. And again, as you go back to Genesis 10, you look at those genealogies, you look at the dates and that information, it seems that he's telling us that the Tower of Babel takes place 100 years after the flood. Now, I realize that a lot of times the genealogies in the Bible are not complete. There's missing generations. There's missing information. Maybe that's the case here. But perhaps it's not. Perhaps this is complete. Because Moses wants us to know how long it took to go from the flood to where men reject Yahweh and start creating their own gods. And so what happens in the Tower of Babel, right? The dividing into nations, the confusing of languages. So all of these are scattered abroad. Genesis chapter 10, they all create their own religion. And what do you have? You have this explosion of idolatry as these nations just go and spread and scatter, which is ironic because that's the very reason they built the tower, so that they wouldn't be scattered abroad, and that's exactly what happened. And so after the Tower of Babel, we've got idolatry in the land of Canaan, but we also have it in Assyria. We have it in Babylon, and we have it in Egypt. We have it all over because why? It all goes back to the Tower of Babel. Thank you so much for joining us for lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, we're going to talk about why. Why did they reject Yahweh? What was so wrong with Yahweh? Why did they start creating their own gods? And I believe that the answer is going to shock you. Things you maybe never considered as to why there is idolatry in the world back then. And I think a lot of the reasons why it exists today as well. Again, thank you for joining us. Here's our information. All of our videos can be found, a link on our webpage, breacfc.org. Or you can go to our YouTube page. Just type in Brea Church of Christ. Click on videos and you'll see all of them there as well. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you in lesson number 2.